All right, good evening. Um, Tonight we're going to talk about Chapter 7, The Americans. It's one of my favorite chapters, but a lot of people consider it boring because it doesn't involve wars or crazy, things that sometimes people prefer to talk about. I'm going to scroll back to the first page, and sorry about any confusing. Sometimes the best laid plans of mice and men, you know the rest. All right, Chapter 7, Balancing Nationalism and Sectionalism. And we've already talked about the differences between nationalism and sectionalism. Nationalism being pride in one's country, and also more than just pride in one's country, but an identification as being, quote unquote, an American or a Frenchman or a Canadian, etc. That is nationalism. It's basically very similar or akin to patriotism. The only problem with nationalism, like any ism, it usually has a good side and a bad side. Sometimes nationalism can lead to ethnocentrism, to protectionism, to isolationism, or worse, racism. So we do have to be careful when we're talking about nationalism. It's not always this great patriotic movement. Sometimes it turns south quickly and can become very ugly, as can sectionalism. Sectionalism is pride in one section or group of people. Example, I'm proud to be a Southerner. I'm proud to be a Northerner, New Englander, etc. So, having understood that there are differences, when we're talking about American history, those differences are predominantly cultural and economic. And we'll cover that as we begin the lecture. We know nationalism and sectionalism have always existed in our country, but this chapter deals with a balancing of nationalism and sectionalism during the early part of the 19th century. You can see the essential ideas. I'm not going to read them to you, but basically they involve economic, cultural, and political questions. Excuse me. The important people in the chapter are James Madison, who we've already talked about in a previous chapter, Henry Clay, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun, and John Marshall. Section 1, Regional Economies Create Differences. The North and the South develop different economic systems that lead to political differences between the regions. By 1801, Eli Whitney had begun to pioneer the use of interchangeable parts. Even when you talk about Eli Whitney, there's an example of sectionalism. If you ask Southern students, hey, what did Eli Whitney do? They'll tell you, for the most part, he invented the cotton gin. If you ask students up north or in the Midwest, they'll usually say interchangeable parts. So it's fascinating there. That's even another example of how sectionalism works even today. But interchangeable parts are basically when you make identical parts that can be substituted for each other and makes manufacturing easier. For instance, a musket or a gun. Okay, a gun has a barrel, it has a stock. A stock is the wooden part that comes up against your shoulder here. It also has triggering mechanisms and several other parts, but we're going to concentrate on the barrels and the stocks. In the past, before we began to use interchangeable parts, if you broke the stock on your weapon or in your gun, you would have to have someone make a stock to fit the rest of the gun. Either that or throw the whole gun out. But Eli Whitney came up with this ingenious idea that, hey, why not make thousands of stocks that are identical, thousands of barrels that are identical, thousands of triggering mechanisms that are identical. That way, if any part breaks, you just order the other part and it automatically fits. And that will begin to speed mass production, and it will also create the factory system we'll talk about in a few minutes. But more importantly, it would help spring America into the Industrial Revolution. We learned about the Industrial Revolution in world history, where it talked about Great Britain and Germany and the rest of Europe. But it will take hold a little bit slower in the US, but once it takes hold, it'll go really fast. It's a social economic reorganization where machines replace hand tools, large scale factory production develops, and the result of manufacturing changes. This is called the Industrial Revolution. Great Britain basically started the Industrial Revolution, and it started with textile mills. Textile mills is another word for cloth mills. Before then, people wove thread in their homes, they made cloth in their homes, they sewed it in their homes. Sometimes they would trade out. One woman might do the thread, another down the road might do the cloth, but it was all built in the homes. The idea of a factory where you had thread, weaving machines, cloth, all this where you can make it all in one place, would really take off during the Industrial Revolution. And a lot of this had to do with the use of water power. Water would turn a wheel, a water wheel, which would be connected by a series of pulleys and clutches, which basically would run an entire factory. In the United States, we mainly got most of our economic success from trading with other countries. However, when Jefferson declared an embargo in 1807 and then War of 1812 blockaded the coast, Americans began to support building things here. When you see the word domestic, like domestic industry, that means built here in the United States. Samuel Slater was a factory worker who came from Great Britain. He memorized the parts of a factory. It was illegal to take plans out of a factory. As a matter of fact, you could be imprisoned or possibly executed for treason. So he didn't take plans on paper. He memorized the different parts of the factory and built one in Rhode Island. Other men like Lowell, Appleton, and Jackson would mechanize all stages of cloth making by 1813. Slater mainly built thread. Weaving factories were built in Waltham, Massachusetts, and Lowell, Massachusetts. And by the late 1820s, Lowell became a booming manufacturing center. Thousands of young women moved from the family farms to work. And see, this was the first time this had ever happened. For the most part, women had stayed home and worked on the farm until they married and they would get their own farm. But something had happened, if you remember, that a lot of men had been killed in the wars. Women, the population of females in some areas was higher than men. Now, in general, it evens itself out, but in some areas, there weren't as many men to marry these women, so they went to the factories to work. And when they got there, they would have a level of independence they didn't have back on the farm. Still, they were kept in dormitories under very tight rules, but nonetheless, they weren't under their father's and mother's guidance. Here's a picture of the Lowell mill. You can see where the water wheel actually was spun by the water, where the water's been dammed right there, and it's connected to these pulleys, which turn the machines, which are operated by a series of clutches. Two completely different economies emerged, however. In the North, cash crops weren't that big. People grew some products, some corn. Out west, they grew wheat. But this type didn't require slavery or anything like that. And they would mainly just sell things at city markets. However, in the South, cash crops like cotton, rice, and indigo and sugarcane would take off. And even though slavery was dying out in the North, Eli Whitney's cotton gin made cotton extremely profitable in the South. And that would lead to an increase in slavery. The plantation system was established in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Slavery became entrenched in society during this time period. This is called the antebellum period, which means before the war. Cotton was hugely profitable. By the 1820s, demands for slaves increased. And before long, slaves outnumbered free people in some states. Here's a picture of Eli Whitney's first cotton gin. You can see where you put the cotton balls in. The cotton itself is caught on these teeth, and the lint or the cotton itself comes out, leaving the seeds to fall in a tray on the bottom. According to Whitney's journals, he was watching a cat try to get at something through a fence, and it was catching part of its fur on the fence. So the idea is not to pull the seeds out of the cotton, but to pull the cotton off the seeds. In 1790, right after independence, you see the distribution of slavery in America. This would rapidly change. This area here would become huge in slave population. You can even see the rapid increase in the number of slaves by 1860. Close to 4 million people were slaves during this time period. In 1800, cotton made up only 7.1% of our exports to other countries. By 1860, it was close to 60%, 57.5%. This gave the South a feeling of invincibility, that, hey, the North won't try to do away with slavery. They won't mess with us because they have to have our cotton, because that's what we trade with Europe. In Europe, if the North tried to stop it, wouldn't let them because they need our cotton. This would be a huge mistake. Henry Clay, though, wanted to try to get people together instead of have pull people apart. He came up with what's known as the American system. Roughly put, it's a series of canals and roads and banking institutions which would link America together. So Southern agriculture could get quickly to Northern markets for production and manufacturing and could be shipped to Europe where finished products could come back. Basically, unite the country by connecting us via roads, canals, and later railroads. He also thought it was important that we quit having these state currencies and have one national currency, the dollar, which did exist, but it was very weak. Okay, but this is called the American system. You can see a picture of some of the finished products here. Here's one of the first home washing machines. Of course, the woman had to crank it, but it was still interesting because it made washing clothes easier. One of the first major infrastructure improvements was the Erie Canal, which linked the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. This was huge. It basically opened up the Midwest cities such as Chicago and Cleveland as ports. Um, as canal building took off, however, railroads became popular. By 1825, the first steam engine was built, and it wouldn't be too long before canals would almost be obsolete because any city could basically become a port of call because railroads could move goods quickly from the actual port cities to these inland cities. However, cities on the river and on the ocean still did much better than inland cities early on because of the tremendous amount of water power. The National Road was finished in 1838 and it went from Cumberland, Maryland, all the way to Vandalia, Illinois. And you see where the Erie Canal, like I said, basically made the Great Lakes connected to the Atlantic Ocean. Other states would build over 3,000 miles of canals by 1837. Here's a picture of canals and railroads that were built and roads. It's fascinating how infrastructure took off. Whenever you hear the word infrastructure, that's roads, bridges, railroads, utilities, anything that connects the country together. The human infrastructure, for example, is basically the skeleton and then the veins inside of that too. So basically, when you hear about bridges collapsing or getting old, that's part of the infrastructure. To pay for all these roads and all this infrastructure improvement, Madison proposed the tariff of 1816, which anything coming into the country, a tax was put on it. And it increased the cost of foreign goods. And it made people more likely to buy American goods, which would become cheaper, and it helped pay for these improvements. People in the North welcomed it because they built the things that people would now have to buy. People in the South and the West didn't really like it because they were having to pay higher prices on things, especially from Europe, but not just from Europe, but from America as well, because now without competition from Europe, many of the American companies began to increase their prices. Clay and Calhoun would sway congressmen from the South and West to approve during this particular time period. Most leaders agreed the national bank and national currency would actually help everybody. And by 1816, the Second Bank of the United States was chartered, and it was chartered for 20 years. James Monroe was elected president in 1816, and this began an era known as the Era of Good Feelings. Here you can look at the cities during the 1820. There were many more cities than this. These were the largest, however. New Orleans and Charleston were the only two major southern cities. You did have Savannah in the south. You had a couple of cities in what is now Tennessee. North Carolina, you had Raleigh. But these were all what we'd call today small towns. Only New Orleans and Charleston would count as decent-sized cities. And that concludes Section 1, and we'll begin Section 2 shortly. Thank you for paying attention, and if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at randy_vice at gmail randy_vice at ecboe.org, or if this is not an Etowah County student, randyvice at gmail.com. If you have any complaints, questions, or input, some things you might think might help improve the video presentations, or say, hey, coach, you missed some things here, or you were incorrect. It happens. Trust me, it happens with every teacher. Feel free to let me know. And again, randyvice at gmail.com for those who are not my current students, Randy_Vice at ECBOE for those who are. I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to do this. I look forward to see you in class at the end of the Christmas break. Thank you. Good night.